Good afternoon. Thank you very much to SMU, Archana, and friends for inviting me to be here. I come from Indonesia, and I've been trying to spend the last 2.5 years or so in an academic domain, trying to understand what and how academics think. And I can tell you without prevaricating, it's actually a lot harder than I thought. And I've also discovered upon completing my recent book, which I spent about 7 or 8 months on, that writing is a lot more difficult than talking. With that, I want to just talk a little bit about Southeast Asia, and I'll qualify myself in that I'm not an AI expert, but I have some views about how technological innovation has graced developing economies in Southeast Asia, and how I think technological innovation is going to imply or impact upon most of the developing economies in Southeast Asia, better yet, beyond. If you travel from a city of Tanwe to Merauke, Tanwe is the westernmost town of Myanmar, or Southeast Asia, Merauke being the easternmost town of Papua, or Southeast Asia. That longitude is about 5,000 kilometers of distance, which is about the distance between LA to Boston. Then if you travel from a little town called Nokmong, which is the northernmost town of Myanmar in Southeast Asia, to a little town called Boa, which is in East Nusa Tenggara, in the eastern parts of Indonesia, the southernmost town of Southeast Asia, a distance of 4,000 kilometers would have been traveled. And that's equivalent to the distance between Tehran and London. So the longitude and latitude give you a sense of both the immensity and diversity of Southeast Asia, which oftentimes get obfuscated with the region's inability to tell stories. Without prevaricating, Southeast Asia is one of the most under-narrated regions in the world. We don't tell stories well enough. The empirical evidence supporting this is that if you take a look at all the books that would have been narrated or written about Southeast Asia, they amount to about 375,000 titles, most of which are written by non-Southeast Asians, in a context of about 140 million books that would have been published ever since the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. So you start figuring out that the narratives or the books about Southeast Asia represent only about 0.26% of all the book titles that would have been published. Kind of a mockery and irony for a region whose population is 700 million, that represents about 9% of the global population. It just says that Southeast Asians, of course with the exception of the Singaporeans, they don't know how to tell stories. They don't know how to document wisdom. If you go to a medicine man in Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, to cure your whatever sprained ankle, that medicine man is gonna throw some herbs on your ankle and say, this is what my great-grandfather used to tell me before he passed. But there was no documented wisdom. And I think that needs to change. If you walk from one end to the other, skip over Singapore, 80 to 90% of the households are headed up by somebody without a tertiary education. Think about that. Indonesia, in point, 88% of the households are headed up by somebody without a tertiary education. 93% of the electorate don't have university education. So when The Southeast Asians outside Singapore complain about the quality of their politicians. They need to recognize that those politicians don't come from planet Mars. They come from themselves. So the need to invest in education or educational attainment is structural. And the empirical evidence is stark. You take a look at the PISA score, which is the attainment of lingual proficiency and STEM proficiency for the 15-year-olds. By the way, I'll get to AI. Only 2 countries score above the global average: Singapore and Vietnam. Singapore has just replaced China as the #1 in the world out of 81 countries. Vietnam, which was in a war until 1975, has surpassed the global average, probably in the top 30 now. Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and all the rest are below the global average. Indonesia is number 69 out of 81 countries. So if you're a CEO of a multinational company, you're thinking about building a factory, the first statistics that you look at is whether or not that particular destination has the vocational wherewithal. And it's correlated with how well they score on PISA. The second is the tertiary education. Southeast Asia has about 8,000 universities with about 19 million students, including the 18,000 students at SMU, including the one campus at SMU. But only 2 universities out of 8,000 universities in Southeast Asia place in the top 20 in the world. Unfortunately, those 2 don't include SMU. Fortunately, those 2 are in Singapore. You compare this with China, which has about 2,600 universities, 39 million students. China has been able to place 2 universities in the top 20. China has disproportionately produced intellectual property way more, way faster than any Southeast Asian country. I mean, if you like the BYDs, that's the ultimate manifestation of intellectual property. So I've been in a camp that tries to think, how does Southeast Asia get itself together to welcome technological innovation so that it's shared by the many? As the wave goes up, how do we figure out a way so that all boats rise, not just a few boats rise? And I'm also in the camp that believes that the only way to take a view proactively with respect to education in Southeast Asia, which I think is very structural, is to look at, or take a second look at the pre-existing principle of subsidiarity within ASEAN. ASEAN is the regional organization that functions with the principle of non-interference. We call that principle of subsidiarity. We leave it to the local. We don't want to interfere. But there is a clause that allows for some type of interference as long as it relates to our ability or increasing our ability to deal with global challenges. I sort of believe that if we were to try to withstand any kind of challenges that are global in nature, it starts with the intellectual and cognitive capacities of every citizen of the 700 million people in this region, without which I think we're exposed. And this has been manifested in the divergence of economic attainment and educational attainment. Take Laos, for example. They're functioning on a GDP per capita of less than $2,000. Singapore, $91,000. Malaysia, $12,000. Indonesia, $5,000. The Philippines, $3,000. So the only way to bring about less divergence and more convergence, economically speaking, is to make sure that everybody within Southeast Asia would score well on PISA. And hopefully there's 10 universities in Southeast Asia that place in the top 10 in the world, considering that we're the fourth most populous region in the world. Actually, number 3, if you take out some other big places like Africa, after China and India. But this doesn't get captured in conversations where there's enough geopolitical realism and economic realism. I've been spending the last 2.5 years at Stanford just trying to bring about more relevance of Southeast Asia to the world, and hopefully the world to Southeast Asia. Now, on the basis, look, the internet was a great invention. It was the ultimate democratizer of information. But on the back of some narratives that are supposedly equating algorithmic amplification with democracy, it somehow didn't translate into a commensurate democratizer of ideas, to the point where ideas have gotten actually polarized. We've got guys on the far left, guys on the far right, and I sort of like have been making this increasing observation that the guys on the right are taking everybody else's lunch, because the guys on the left have to campaign with a message of hope. But once everybody finds out that he plagiarized when he was a sophomore, there goes his credibility. There goes his message of hope. Whereas the guys on the right have been able to get away with the message of fear and or intimidation. If you don't vote for me, they're going to rape you. They're going to rob you. Nobody's going to question your credibility. Nobody's going to question as to whether or not you plagiarized. And we're seeing this calculus of politics and calculus of geopolitics shifting to the right. And this is also on the back of what I see as rising inequality of wealth, rising inequality of income, rising inequality of opportunities, and rising centripetalism of economic development. Most developing economies in Southeast Asia have seen a faster economic development within the primary cities, as opposed to those in the secondary, much less regional towns. And that centripetality is not going to help. And we have also seen how China's economy has outperformed Southeast Asia's economy. If you take a look at the last 30 years, the GDP per capita of China has grown by about 10 times, as compared to the GDP per capita of Southeast Asia having grown only 2.7 times. And this disparity would have been on the back of 5 attributes. 1, the underinvestment in education. 2nd, underinvestment in infrastructure. 3rd, lack of governance. 4th, lack of competitiveness. You go to China, their ability to issue business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis, it's about 10. They can issue 10 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis in a year. Whereas Southeast Asia, only 1 business license on a per 1,000 adult people basis. Singapore is an exception, 9 to 10. Philippines, 0.3. Indonesia, 0.3. But on average, Southeast Asia has only been able to issue about 1 business license on a per 1,000 adult people basis. And the last bit is, paradoxically, how China as an autocracy has been able to decentralize economic activities. Their politics is centralized, but their economic activities are more decentralized. Whereas we in Indonesia and our friends in India, we pride ourselves as being a democracy that's politically decentralized, but our economic activities are much more centralized. If you live in an eastern part of Java, you want to go do business with somebody in Stuttgart, you have to get the permission from Jakarta. Whereas if you're in Chongqing, you want to cut a deal with Daimler in Stuttgart, you don't have to consult with Beijing. It's quite paradoxical. But I think this has entailed in some disparity in terms of the economic achievements between China and Southeast Asia in the last 30 years. And you add to that the inability to democratize ideas, the increasing polarization of ideas. This has been manifested in greater inequalities in most economies in Southeast Asia. Just take a look at the Gini coefficient ratios. That's, I think, one of the most empirical evidences that would corroborate the argument or thesis that inequalities have risen on the back of that lack of democratization of ideas. Next. The internet is pervasively used in Southeast Asia. I think I could generalize with respect to other parts of the world. And our kids, they use their handphones. Next page, please. In the report, it says 5 to 6 hours. But I know my daughter uses it for 9 to 10 hours. And we have shifted from a place where, when I grew up, when I was a kid, there was tremendous degree of overprotection with respect to anything but physical activities. But now, we're living in an era where overly protective with respect to offline activities, but underprotective with respect to online activities. We get scared when our kids try to cross the road because the cows are moving. The rickshaws are moving. The buses and trucks are moving. But we don't do anything when our kids look at their handphones, when those TikToks are showing you unhealthy contents. We're completely, if not significantly, underprotective with respect to what they look at for 8 to 10 hours. That, I think, is a characteristic of not only most economies in Southeast Asia, but I think for the most parts of the world. Next. I've talked about PISA. I've talked about tertiary education in Southeast Asia. I think the only way to improve upon the pre-existing situation educationally in Southeast Asia is to relook at that principle of subsidiarity within ASEAN. Do we need to revise upon that? Because I say this with full cognizance of the fact that there is so much political neurosis in local politics everywhere. Without some degree of interference or intervention, I think it's going to be very tough to improve upon. A concrete example would be, how about if we copycat the educational system of Singapore for purposes of Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all the rest? But it depends on the Singaporeans. Would they be cool with it? To the extent they're not cool with it, then it's probably not going to work. I think Singapore has proven to be a great educational domain for lots of people, including non-Singaporeans. Next. Okay, I'm going to get to technological innovation. Anybody know how much more energy is used when you do a simple search on ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, compared to a simple search on Google? It's about 10 to 50 times. Anybody here use Sora? Okay. It's a platform that you use to create sophisticated AI-generated images. It uses about 10,000 to 50,000 times more energy than a simple search on Google. So, anytime you twiddle your two thumbs using AI, keep in mind that it uses disproportionately more energy than a simple search on Google. And the electrification of Southeast Asia is still suboptimal. If you take a look at the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, only 2 countries are electrified at more than 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita: Brunei and Singapore. They're LeBron James from an electricity standpoint, or Steph Curry. Indonesia is only at 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita, similar to that in India. Malaysia at 5,000. Cambodia, Myanmar, far less than Indonesia. So the question is, what would it take for Southeast Asia to modernize? In order to attain modernity, it needs to be at least at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita before rebasing itself to an AI baseline, which in my view, I think should be at 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. The United States is at 10,000. The US has built about 1,300 gigawatts of power generation. About 2,600 gigawatts are in the wait list to enter the grid because the US wants to AI itself to the next level. So I'm only talking about a moderate new baseline of 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita for Southeast Asia, at the exclusion of Brunei and Singapore. Southeast Asia needs to rebuild using renewables, most of its 400,000 megawatts, and it needs to build, on top of that, an additional terawatt, which is 1 million megawatts. You know how much that's going to cost? At least $3 trillion. That's the economic realism. Now, how do we get that kind of money? $3 trillion for Southeast Asia to attain that new baseline of 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita before rebasing ourselves to the next level where we can actually AI ourselves the way our friends and brothers and sisters in Shenzhen and Mountain View can. It depends on our economic spaces. Our economic spaces, we take a look at the fiscal space. The fiscal space is manifested in the tax ratios. The tax ratios of Southeast Asian countries range from 10% to 16%. Indonesia at 10%, Singapore I think 15 to 16%, but they're disproportionately lower than a typical OECD country. A typical OECD country runs on a tax ratio of 33%. So you know right there from a fiscal standpoint, we're structurally limited. So what's the next source of money? It's called the money supply, the monetary space. Singapore is above 200% in terms of the money supply to GDP ratio. But Indonesia runs at a rate of 45%. The Philippines, I think 80-something%. Laos also sub 100%. For any country to have adequate amount of money supply to usher any kind of technological innovation, you need to be at least at 150%. But most countries in Southeast Asia don't have money supply to GDP ratios of 150%. They have less than 100%. So I would argue that from a fiscal and monetary standpoint, Southeast Asia is structurally limited. Next. So the way to do it is to get money from outside, unless Washington consensus would permit us to print money. But I don't think we want to disobey that ideology, even though the Americans and their friends have been printing a lot of money in the last few decades. But I don't see elites or political elites in Southeast Asia wanting to print or do quantitative easing. So the only way out is to bring about money from outside. And right now is not the wisest time to borrow because interest rates have been spiking up. The risk-free rate is already above 4%. So the way out is really to bring about foreign direct investment. And this is where it gets really tricky. Southeast Asia, next. Oh, actually, move back 2 slides. Southeast Asia gets about $200 to $230 billion worth of FDI per year, of which Singapore gets about $100 to $140 billion every year. Indonesia gets about $30 billion. Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam each gets about 10 to 20 billion. If you take a look at the average capacity of every citizen in each country, Singapore gets about $19,000 to $20,000 worth of FDI per capita per year. Whereas the rest, the big ones, they get about $100 to $400 worth of FDI. I'll repeat, Indonesia, $100, Singapore, $19,000 to $20,000. Why does capital move to Singapore disproportionately more than to Indonesia? The last time I checked, Indonesia has more islands than Singapore. It's predominantly because of the rule of law. So investment or capital allocation is not a function of ideology, nor is it a function of geography, nor is it a function of whether or not there's natural resources. It's a function of whether or not the rule of law works. Singapore has been tremendously good in upholding whatever that needs to be upheld. And the second, which I think is not too unimportant, is the lack of ability to translate from uncertainties to risks. Uncertainties are unknown unknowns. Risks are known unknowns. Risks are stuff that you can actually assign probabilistic scenarios to. If somebody in Papua tells a potential investor, there's a 68% probability that there's going to be a blackout for 2.5 months in a year, your factory is going to have its top line affected by 12%, bottom line affected by 18%. So the potential investor can calculate, okay, I think my IRR is going to be like this, on a levered basis or on an unlevered basis. But you go to another place in Southeast Asia, and the guy just goes, I hope to God there's not going to be any blackout. That's uncertainty. Whereas the first scenario is risk. So I think to the extent that Southeast Asians can improve upon their wherewithal to translate uncertainties into risks while they're working on basically getting the rule of law better, we might have a chance to increase the FDI flow into Southeast Asia to a much larger figure than 200 to 230 billion. And I think the non-Singaporean countries will have a much greater chance of attracting capital beyond the 30 billion or 10 to 20 billion for Indonesia and the rest respectively. Without any of this, we're not going to be able to AI ourselves to wherever we want to be. So I think the structural limitation to a place like Southeast Asia in its attempt to embrace the AI narrative would be to figure out how to get more money into the region by way of improving upon this translational capacity, but also the rule of law and the educational attainment, without which I think it's going to be tough. Next. 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 I've talked about the investment requirements just for the power. And I think AI has seemingly appeared a bit more elitist at the rate that only a handful of institutions within the US and China are in increasing control of the narrative as compared to the many. And I speak for 84% of the planet, which are called the Global South, which don't earn any more than $13,205 per capita per year. I think they're at risk of not being able to uphold the rule of law. They're at risk of not being able to translate from uncertainties to risks. They're at risk of not being able to attain the necessary economic capital. To the extent that happens, they're at risk of basically seeing Gini coefficient ratios rising to a higher level. Next. I've talked about this, the comparison between China and Southeast Asia, how China's GDP per capita has gone up by 9 to 10 times, Southeast Asia's 2.7 times on the back of those 5 attributes. Next. I've talked about this. This is a depiction of the electrification of Southeast Asia. All 10 countries compared with China and India. Anybody here following the COP discussion, the climate change discussion? We hear so many of these politicians talking about how they're going to be able to attain carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060. I'll give you one example which does not reconcile with some of those political narratives or rhetoric. Indonesia has a power generation capability of about 90,000 megawatts. It builds about 3,000 to 5,000. If it continues to build at a rate of 5,000 megawatts per year, it'll need about 60 years to reach modernity, which is completely irreconcilable with the 20-year period until 2050 or 25-year period. So the only way to do this is to ramp up the denominator. How do you build at least 10 to 20,000 megawatts? That will, I think, help Indonesia in, number one, powering itself to modernity, hopefully beyond, but also attaining carbon neutrality. Now, I've talked about education. We talk about STEM all the time. Southeast Asia produces about 750 STEM graduates every year, many of which come out of the great universities in Singapore. India produces about 2 to 2.5. China produces about 4 to 4.5. If we hear the political leaders in Southeast Asia, they talk about the golden age in 2045, which is only 20 years away from today, and they talk about how big the demographic bonus is. I'll use a small example in Indonesia. Typically, people use the definition of below 29 years old as a demographic bonus. I'm going to be a bit more conservative. I'm going to use those aged below 15 years old, which is a smaller sample than the 29-year-olds or below. In Indonesia, those aged below 15 years old are about 24% of the population. 24% of 280 million people, that's about 70-something million. And if we can only produce 250,000 STEM graduates in Indonesia, and if we want to convert everyone into STEM from within this pool of under 15-year-olds, it's going to take around 300 years. That's the political and economic realism. Of course, we're not going to be able to convert 100%. Let's assume we use the Malaysia approach. Malaysia, I think, is the highest conversion rate at 40%. Anybody that goes to university, 40% of the university students choose to study STEM. If we were to assume 40% of that pool of 70 million people, which is about 28 million people, and still be able to produce only 250,000 STEM graduates per year, it's still going to take more than 100 years. In 100 years, I don't know where AI is going to be at. So the only way out is to make sure that we produce at least, in my view, 2.5 million for Southeast Asia. At least 1 million STEM graduates in Indonesia, with which I think we can start understanding where the AI narrative is going to go forward. Next. $84% of the planet earn less than $13,205 per capita per year. I don't think they're going to like the closed source and for-profit kind of model. DeepSeek was hugely inspirational. I think there's lots of debates about the orders of magnitude. But one thing that cannot be debated is that here's a guy, Lian Wenfeng, who came from a 4th or 5th tier town in China, came up with the idea, almost definitely cheaper than OpenAI, and chose to do it on an open source basis, and not for profit. That kind of resonates to people in Africa, people in Laos, people in Indonesia. And I think to bring about better educational attainment, to bring about more shared prosperity, stuff like this is what's going to resonate more than the others. I'm not discounting the others, but I'm just saying this with an intuition that I think most members of the Global South will need the necessary incrementalism, will need the episodic nonlinearity so that they could actually climb up the value chain, climb up the global geopolitical order, and be able to expand upon their pre-existing strategic autonomy. My last comment would be, what do I think in terms of the natural inclination for Southeast Asia with respect to China and the West? I'm in a camp that believes that China and the West are indispensable inevitabilities for the next 50 to 100 years. But I'm also in a camp that increasingly believes that China is going to be a more natural technological capital allocator. Not because China has proven itself to be 0 to 1. China has proven itself to be a great 1 to the next digit. And China sells it cheaper. And cheap resonates to anybody that earns $2,000 a year. Cheap resonates to anybody that earns $5,000 per year in Laos and Indonesia, respectively. The Singaporeans can afford all the iPhones they want, but the Indonesians can only afford the Oppos. Whereas the West, I think, is going to increasingly look like a natural economic capital allocator. Why? On the back of two things. The West is blessed with about $140 trillion worth of liquidity, including the United States, North America, Western European countries, their friends in South Korea, Japan, and Middle East. They've got to diversify out capital on the back of increasing risk premium. They've got to diversify out to other places, including Southeast Asia, which I think needs to learn how to translate uncertainties into risks, needs to learn to uphold the rule of law better. That's the first account. The second account as to why the West is a more natural economic capital allocator. China embarked upon this Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 with the ambition, aspiration, or goal of deploying economic capital and technology to Southeast Asia amounting to about $800 billion. But thus far, after 12 years, only $80 billion have been deployed. A tenth. This is on the back of two things. Number one, the destination countries have not been able to show the necessary transparency, accountability, governance, and all that good stuff. But also, the dual circulation economic philosophy of Xi Jinping, I think, has dovetailed into increasing domestic consumptive propensity. You see it, the ratio of domestic consumption to the GDP has risen quite significantly. This would be relatively at the expense of lower exportation of goods and services as a ratio to the GDP, as a result of which they're not going to be able to export foreign exchange. So the way out of this is really for them to popularize the renminbi. But the renminbi within the SWIFT landscape still occupies about 3 to 5%, whereas the dollar has gone up from 43% to 49% of the SWIFT landscape. So until such time that that gets fixed, I think we're going to be susceptible to economic capital allocation from the West, whereas from China, technological capital allocation. Thank you very much.